Hello, Gold participants from around the world. Welcome to Gold Lactation Online Conference for 2013. I'm Fiona Langsharp, IBCLC and team member of Gold Lactation Online Conference. Our presentation today is Back to the Future on HIV and Breastfeeding, the findings that transformed policy, as presented by Pamela Morrison. Thank you for joining us today. Pamela Morrison has been speaking and writing on behalf of breastfeeding in the context of HIV since 1995. Having certified in 1990 as the first IBCLC in Zimbabwe, a country with extremely high HIV prevalence, she worked in private practice and served as a member of the Zimbabwe National Multisectoral Breastfeeding Committee. Pamela has also worked as a BFHI trainer and assessor and assisted the development of national code legislation and HIV and breastfeeding policy. She emigrated to Australia in 2003 and subsequently to England in 2005. Serving as a co-coordinator of the WABA Task Forces on Human Rights from 2001 to 2002 and on breastfeeding and HIV from 2005 to 2009. Pamela recently completed writing the WABA 2012 publication, International Policy on HIV and Breastfeeding, a comprehensive resource. Welcome, Pamela.
Thank you very much, Fiona, and hi everyone. I'd like to say good morning to those from Australia and good evening from everybody else. And here it's midnight, so I'm glad that everybody's bright-eyed and bushy-tailed over there. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to speak to you at this really lovely Gold 13 conference, and I'd like to welcome you to my session Back to the Future on HIV and Breastfeeding, the findings that transformed policy. I'd just like to give you a little background on how I became interested in this really controversial topic. I'd lived in East and Southern Africa from the age of 8, and by coincidence these are the areas of the world most badly affected by HIV. And I'd spent almost all my adult life in Zimbabwe. From 1990, I'd worked as a private practice lactation consultant in Harare, and anonymous sentinel surveillance testing there showed that HIV prevalence amongst pregnant women was almost 40%, and that's really high. But it seemed to be a disease that affected the very poor people, and now I know that that's not true, but at the time it seemed like it. So the kind of mothers that were privileged enough to be able to afford a lactation consultant were not the kind I thought who would suffer from HIV, and consequently it didn't seem to loom terribly large on my radar. And breastfeeding was actually the cultural norm, and it's absolutely necessary for the health and economic reasons in a resource-poor setting, and not breastfeeding was seen as not an option. So even if HIV was transmitted through breastfeeding, it wasn't going to disturb breastfeeding, or so I thought there. But in December 1995, I had a call from a mother who had been referred to me by La Leche League, and she told me she'd just tested HIV positive. She had an 8-month-old breastfed baby, and her doctor had told her to wean immediately, but the baby was refusing a bottle, and she was desperate for information. So I said that I'd see what I could find out and get back to her. And I was absolutely horrified to discover that no one really could give me any information. I contacted the Ministry of Health, I went to see one of the doctors there, I went to see the AIDS organizations, and there was very little research. And what I gradually found out was that the thing was like a maze. There was blind alleys and tantalizing dead ends, and we needed more answers. And so it went on. Within a couple of years, it began to seem that the risks of breastfeeding were actually being exaggerated, and the risks of formula feeding were being trivialized, and in the process breastfeeding was almost turned into an endangered practice. So I became highly motivated to find out as much as I could about it. At this point, I should probably make a disclaimer. I worked for WABA from 2005 to 2009, and again throughout 2012. So I'm the author, as Fiona's already told you, with the help of 8 excellent reviewers, of a set of documents called Understanding International Policy on HIV and Breastfeeding, and we used to call this the HIV kit. We worked on it so long, some of us. It was finally published in December 2012 after a really complicated history. And Genevieve Becker actually took over the 2009 version and rewrote it. And then I took it back again last year. So this work provided me with the opportunity to collect and compile and review most of the papers on HIV and infant feeding that I've used to prepare this session, and the links to this kit are in your handout. So during this session we'll be talking about how global policy has seemed to change throughout the time 1985 to date and has seemed to come full circle. We've moved from a situation where breastfeeding was protected and supported for a dozen years in spite of the fact that HIV was apparently transmitted through breastfeeding. And then recommendations were made to avoid breastfeeding and to replace it with formula feeding. So we'll look at some of the early research studies showing how babies became infected through breastfeeding, and though they're still being cited today, so that you can be familiar with this framing of the problem. And then a little more recently, and thanks to some really good research, we'll see how breastfeeding is enjoying a comeback. And thanks to the development of some antiretroviral regimens, this has helped enormously. And then eventually it became clear that formula feeding had a very negative impact on HIV-free survival, meaning the number of children who are both alive and HIV-free at, say, 2 years of age. And this finding, in turn, provoked a very thorough re-examination of global policy from about 2008 onwards. And this created an about turn in the way that mothers were being counselled. So now it looks as if we're back where we started, with a clear base for promoting breastfeeding once again. And the evidence is even sufficient that even in the UK and the US, the policymakers are relaxing their former prohibitions against breastfeeding for HIV-positive mothers. So, not surprisingly, so many policy changes and about turns over the years have caused a lot of confusion. And in this session I hope to clarify some of the myth information that's out there, so that you'll know where to find the most up-to-date information and guidance to share with your clients and your colleagues. So in the years before the discovery that HIV could be transmitted through breastfeeding, it had enjoyed really unprecedented support. And this was necessary because mortality was so high amongst parts of the world where children were normally breastfed, and disturbing breastfeeding would have made mortality even higher. So it was recognized that breastfeeding was critical to HIV-free survival and under 5 survival, especially in the continent that was most ravaged by HIV. The growing respect accorded to breastfeeding eventually led to adoption of the 1981 Code of Marketing of Breast Milks substitutes. So we had a lot of support for breastfeeding before HIV hit the scene. However, disaster struck in April 1985. A report from Australia published in The Lancet described how a baby boy born via caesarean section and breastfed for 6 weeks had been infected through breastfeeding. After the Caesar, his mother had received 2 blood transfusions, and 1 unit had eventually been found to come from a male donor who developed AIDS 13 months later. Both mother and baby were found to produce antibodies to HIV. So what had happened was that the donor had infected the mother via his blood, and the mother had infected the baby through her milk. In October of the same year, Belgian researchers working in Rwanda and Zaire reported isolating the virus that caused AIDS from cell-free breast milk. And by December 1985, there seemed to be sufficient evidence to form the basis of the US and European recommendations that HIV-positive mothers should avoid all breastfeeding. Now, there's been a catch-22 in consequence of this policy. The industrialized countries correctly point out that they don't have any locally conducted research on the risk of HIV through breastfeeding, and this is true because they've effectively banned it. So all the research on breastfeeding in the context of HIV has, of necessity, been conducted in developing countries. However, because breastfeeding has been prohibited in industrialized countries, it has been possible to get a fix on the risk of transmission during pregnancy and delivery alone, without it being confused with transmission through breastfeeding. And this is a crucial piece of the evidence that we've needed to defend breastfeeding in the context of HIV. So although it's been a pretty poor thing, it actually has helped us in the end. So when is HIV transmitted from mother to child? A critical piece of the puzzle has been the fact that there's a very wide window period which can last from 6 weeks to 3 months in HIV testing techniques, and it's that piece of the puzzle has not quite been found yet. So HIV can be transmitted from mother to child during pregnancy, and that can be diagnosed within a couple of days of birth. During labour and birth, which can't be ruled out until 6 weeks after birth, even with the currently used tests, and of course through breastfeeding. And confusion about the timing of transmission has led to confusion about the route of transmission. Now, I'd like to talk about breastfeeding transmission without the use of what we call ART, antiretroviral therapy. And I've chosen to share these papers with you because they're cited all the time, especially in any piece of writing suggesting that HIV-positive mothers shouldn't breastfeed. The first and the most often cited, literally hundreds of times, is this one by David Dunn. And he found that when a mother had had HIV for a while, it was an old infection, the risk of her baby becoming infected through breastfeeding was about 14%. On the other hand, if the mother had recently been infected, the risk was doubled at about 29%. In a very famous randomized control trial, a lady called Ruth Ndwati in Nairobi assigned mothers to either breastfeed or bottle feed, and she found that breastfeeding was responsible for 16% of HIV transmission. And then a man called Kevin de Kock, who works for WHO, wrote a review paper using both those results as well, and he came up with these figures. He said that no breastfeeding caused 15 to 30% of babies to become infected. Breastfeeding for 6 months led to 25 to 35% of them being infected, and breastfeeding for 18 to 24 months caused 30 to 45% of exposed babies to become infected. In any paper, when you read about HIV and breastfeeding, it's very important to actually read more than just the abstract. The fine print tells you quite a lot about what's going on, and usually breastfeeding is very poorly defined and often means any breastfeeding, even if the baby was mostly formula fed. It's quite important to see if the baby was actually mixed fed, and we'll talk about the significance of exclusive breastfeeding a bit later. And finally, in 2000, WHO issued a review of transmission of HIV through breastfeeding, which was originally written by Ruth Andrade once again, and she said that in populations where breastfeeding is the main method of infant feeding, breast milk transmission accounts for 1/3 of pediatric HIV. Now, a very clever lady called Ellen Pewas made a good presentation at a WABA conference in Arusha in 2002, and she told us more about the route of transmission. She said that 7% of babies become infected in utero, 15% of babies are infected during labor and delivery, and 15% are infected if they're breastfed for 2 years, and 63% remain uninfected. And I must remember to turn that off, so that you can see that the risk surrounding the short 24 hours of birth is the same as the risk of 24 months during breastfeeding. But most tantalizing of all is that most babies do not become infected. Now, what kind of research has been done into preventing mother-to-child transmission? Various methods have been tried. Firstly, it's important to define breastfeeding, and secondly, the research that has been done avoiding breastfeeding altogether using replacements for breast milk, which is formula, breastfeeding for a short time and then stopping, breastfeeding exclusively with no other foods and liquids, which we know is protective against other infections, breastfeeding with various antiretroviral regimens, either for the mother or for the baby or both, and finally breastfeeding with ART. So a lot of things have been tried. For the first 12 years, following the discovery that HIV could be passed through breast milk, the global HIV and infant feeding recommendations followed quite a pragmatic public health approach. Research between 1985 and 1997 continued to document that transmission occurred through breastfeeding, but mothers were advised to carry on the basis that the risk of death from transmission of HIV through breastfeeding was likely to be less than the risk of death if breastfeeding was withheld. So several important documents, which I've listed here, omitted maternal HIV as a risk factor. We have the 1989 Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Innocenti Declaration, which you know about, the 1991, the beginning of the Baby Friendly Hospital Initiative. Originally the documents did not mention HIV, and in 1992 WABA held the first World Breastfeeding Week. Again, there was no mention of HIV, and in 1993 the breastfeeding counselling course for health workers, and again very much in favour of breastfeeding. In 1987 we had the initial global HIV and infant feeding guidelines, and they also supported universal breastfeeding. WHO said that breastfeeding should continue to be promoted, supported and protected in both developing and developed countries. And this rationale was made on the basis that breastfeeding benefits were comparable or even exceeded the apparently small risk of HIV transmission through breastfeeding. 5 years later, the 1992 Global HIV and Infant Feeding Guidelines also endorsed breastfeeding because it was considered again that the baby's risk of infection through breast milk was likely to be lower than the risk of death from other causes if breastfeeding were to be abandoned. In 1994, which was only 2 years after the last pronouncement by WHO, they held the first clinical trials in Thailand on what was called a short course antiretroviral regimen to prevent mother-to-child transmission amongst non-breastfed babies. And this had quite dramatic results. It was found that transmission was reduced by 1/2 to 2/3. And as a result of this new drug regimen, between 1994 and 95, the number of babies infected in utero and during delivery in developed countries dropped by a whopping 78%. And that was quite dramatic. However, as a result of this success, the feeling emerged that it was breastfeeding itself that was hindering the success of what they called PMTCT, prevention of mother-to-child transmission efforts. And you can see this attitude expressed in the type of language used in this excerpt of a Medscape editorial. And this gentleman says that given the intractability of widespread breastfeeding in the region, i.e. in Africa, the benefit of PMTCT was totally abrogated by the extended intake of breast milk. Oh dear. So in 1997, this feeling had really crystallized, and UNAIDS, WHO and UNICEF issued a new policy statement in favor of alternatives to breastfeeding for HIV-positive mothers, and they said that 1/3 of infants are infected through breastfeeding, and then they made an assumption about the safety of formula feeding. They said when children are born to HIV-infected women who can be assured of uninterrupted access to nutritionally adequate breast milk substitutes that are safely prepared and fed to them, they are at less risk of illness and death if they are not breastfed. And then from the platform of a human rights perspective, they introduced for the first time the concept of maternal infant feeding choice, saying the policy objective must be to minimize all infant feeding risks and to urgently expand adequate alternatives so that HIV-infected women have a range of choices. They stress the need for formula to be made available and for safe formula feeding conditions. And they said the policy should also stipulate what measures are being taken to make breast milk substitutes available and affordable, to teach the safest means of feeding them to infants, and to provide the conditions which will diminish the risks of using them. And this made a lot of us very unhappy when it happened. The following year, in 1998, UNICEF announced that it was to set up pilot sites to provide free formula to 30,000 HIV-positive mothers in 11 developing countries. So mothers would be offered HIV testing, and for mothers who tested positive, there would be ART and free formula. And this was written up later by a nice young guy that I got to know in Harare called Arjen de Wacht, who had been with UNICEF in the late 90s, and David Clark, who we know as the UNICEF code expert, and it makes very interesting reading. It was recognized that this initiative was not underpinned by research on the risks and benefits of formula feeding in resource-poor settings, but the situation was characterized as an emergency that couldn't wait. and that action must be taken now. There were a lot of early concerns, and Ellen Pewas and her colleague Elizabeth Preble wrote a very good document called A Chronology of Research and Policy Advances in 1998, and they expressed several concerns. They recognized the limitation in HIV testing, which meant that the route of HIV transmission could not be identified, and thus that breastfeeding-associated transmission couldn't be accurately measured. They were concerned about the design, analysis, and interpretation of current research, and they said that the risks associated with artificial feeding were unknown. Now, a set of documents was brought out in 1998 also, which was referred to as the grey matter. And it was based on the rationale that it was necessary to prevent postnatal transmission because 80% of the babies would remain uninfected at birth. So between 1998 and 2000, WHO, UNICEF and UNAIDS developed, field-tested and published an infant feeding counselling course. A large part of the course focused on teaching health workers how to help HIV-positive mothers to choose and carry out so-called replacement feeding, which meant, of course, formula feeding. And I attended the field testing of the counselling course in Harare in March 1999, and it was an unforgettable experience. We worked to prepare 4 different kinds of commercial or home-prepared formula. We worked on the floor with our equipment spread out on newspaper, and we had to carry water to the site as if we were living in a rural village, and we boiled the water on a wood fire to duplicate conditions that would have been found in a typical African home. And it took a long time, and it was really quite a shocking experience. In 2000, WHO released a detailed set of HIV infant feeding recommendations to give effect to the plans of the last few years. And they said breastfeeding poses a significant risk. In untreated women, the risk is 10 to 20%, but seems to be greatest amongst in the first few months of life, but may persist throughout any breastfeeding. And what are called the AFAS conditions were first mentioned. This means that when replacement feeding is acceptable, feasible, affordable, sustainable, and safe, breastfeeding is recommended. If that's not possible, then breastfeeding should be discontinued as soon as possible. However, after receiving all this information, mothers themselves should choose how they wanted to breastfeed their babies. Now this satisfies, sorry, I'm going on too fast. This seems to satisfy human rights principles, but it's important to realize that in Western countries, mothers expect to be able to choose how they'll feed their babies and whether they'll breastfeed or not. But in African societies where all the babies are breastfed, if a mother was told about an alternative feeding method, she was often quite surprised, and she took this as a recommendation rather than an option. After all, why would a nurse in a white uniform bother to tell her about something if she wasn't actually going to use it? So we come to the research actually endorsing replacement feeding. And in the following few years, many papers and reports were published. Donations of formula were also made by many church groups and other NGOs to save babies from HIV through breastfeeding. So in one of the most famous papers to come out was this one in Nairobi, that stated that 44% of infant HIV infections were averted with the use of formula. In 2001, the same group apparently found that morbidity due to diarrhea and pneumonia was identical in breastfed and formula-fed infants, but the more formula-fed infants were still alive at age 2. And this influenced the WHO 2004 guidelines when they published another review, and they said that 30 to 45% of HIV-exposed infants were infected if they were breastfed for 18 to 24 months. So it all looked rather dire in the first few years. And between 2000 and 2005, WHO and UNICEF issued several more important documents lending support to the recommendation for replacement feeding. There was the 2003 Global Strategy, the 2003 HIV and Infant Feeding Framework. In 2004, WHO issued updated versions of the original 1998 documents, and in 2005 there was a review of transmission done again from South Africa at the conference there, and in 2005 there was also a set of counselling tools in recognition that counselling and support for HIV positive mothers is the most demanding aspect of PMTCT's programs. And this was done to clarify what steps needed to be taken during a counselling session, showing how to counsel HIV positive mothers about feeding formulas, if not from birth, then at the latest at 6 months. Now we come to the experience of the pilot sites, and between January 2000 and June 2002 they served roughly 385,000 HIV-positive mothers. However, on average, less than half of those mothers received any kind of ART, and infant feeding counselling and formula feeding were often the only interventions. Formula feeding was found to be feasible, acceptable and affordable, probably because it was free, but no information has ever been released by UNICEF about the numbers of babies who were saved from postnatal transmission by not being breastfed, nor about the health outcomes for the formula-fed babies. In fact, there was no monitoring mechanism built into the original pilot programs, which could have informed the later scaling up and rolling out of the what they called the PMTCT initiative worldwide. However, there is a surprising amount of research gathered from the sites about the experience of counselling, and various authors have described how difficult it was for the counsellors themselves, and they tried to do their best with inadequate training, ambiguous guidelines. There was a bias towards formula feeding. Recommendations kept changing, too little time, too few staff, and one of the very important things was that clients were unable to either exclusively breastfeed or exclusively formula feed, so they ended up mixed feeding, which was by far the most risky infant feeding method of all, as we'll see in a minute. However, the first formal report on the dangers of formula feeding was received in 2006, and this was quite shocking. It came from Botswana. Botswana is a comparatively rich country, and the government there had recommended that all HIV-positive mothers should formula feed, and in fact over 60% did so, receiving free formula from the hospitals and the clinics. But that year, late 2005, they had widespread flooding, and there was very serious water contamination. Over 500 babies died. It was found that there was 25-fold mortality for formula-fed babies. So the government of Botswana called in the CDC in America, and Dr. Tracy Creek of the CDC conducted a detailed investigation. She identified over 33 cases of cryptosporidium and E. coli. Some villagers lost over 30% of their babies, but only one breastfed baby had died. And she also found that there had been spillover of formula feeding to 15% of HIV uninfected mothers. This was the first negative published report that had been received, but there would be more to come. In late 2006, this report did provoke WHO to hold another technical consultation on HIV and infant feeding. This was the first since 2000, and they looked at the experience and the evidence, including the Tracy Creek results. And many of us in the lactation world were disappointed with the new recommendations coming from this meeting. The major change from the previous recommendations was an easing of an absolutely firm assumption about the safety of formula feeding, and now they issued a more cautionary recommendation that exclusive breastfeeding was recommended for the first 6 months unless formula feeding was considered to be AFAS. However, after the 2006 findings of Tracy Creek, it almost seemed as if the lid had been blown off an expose of what had happened to formula-fed babies in the expanded PMTCT sites. In Botswana, another study was done, and oh, sorry, I've lost my mouse. Yes, another study was done by a different group of researchers who found that there was no survival advantage to formula feeding at 6 months. Fewer breastfed children acquired HIV, but more uninfected children died. In Zambia, down here, they had similar results. They again found fewer babies became infected with HIV, but there were more deaths from other infections. And in Uganda, formula feeding was found to be more risky than breastfeeding at 12 months. So that was quite a big surprise. Now, the other intervention that had been tried was exclusive breastfeeding. And you can see that from the top study in South Africa, that this first study had already been done in 1999. And I think that later the focus on exclusive breastfeeding was in large measure due to the failure of the success of formula feeding. So success was almost by default in the beginning. Back in 1999, a lady called Anna Koutsoudis had found that in untreated mothers there was no difference in the risk of transmission of HIV between breastfed and formula-fed babies at 3 months. In other words, exclusive breastfeeding led to no extra transmissions compared to formula feeding. And in another paper, follow-up in 2001, it was found that exclusive breastfeeding for only 3 months led to very low rates of transmission even later. Most importantly, there was a much higher rate of HIV transmission to babies who had been mixed fed, i.e. those who'd had breastfeeding and other foods and liquids. Now, interestingly, the first of these papers had been published before the first recommendations had been made for the pilot sites, but it was virtually ignored at the time, and the thinking had been that the results needed to be duplicated before exclusive breastfeeding could be promoted. But several years later, there was another study done, which was very carefully done in Zimbabwe and called the Jutamba Project. It had been started in 1997, but the results were not published until 2005. Now, these researchers found that even when there was no ART, the risk of transmission during 3 months of exclusive breastfeeding was only 1.3%. And this was quite amazing, really. And later, mixed feeding also led to a very reduced risk of transmission to 18 months. Finally, in 2007, Professor Jerry Huvardia in South Africa, also South Africa, published a paper in The Lancet looking at exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months. And he found then that only 4% of babies became infected, even though, if you read the small print of that paper, he allowed 3 lapses of other foods and liquids in his definition of exclusive breastfeeding. And personally, I wonder if that doesn't account for the 4% slightly higher rate. So most importantly, the data from both the Gitambo and the Cavadia papers show that exclusive compared to mixed feeding reduces the risk of transmission of HIV between 4 and 11-fold. The next thing that we need to look at are the antiretroviral interventions, which we've seen since 1994 was first started. And there are various different kinds that were used. To begin with, there were short course regimens, and later there were long course regimens, and then there were all sorts of variations in between. With the short course regimens, it was found that the drug AZT reduced vertical transmission by about half. And then it was found that a less expensive single dose drug called nevirapine for the mother in labor and the infant within 72 hours of birth also reduced transmission by 50%, even when breastfeeding continued. And single dose nevirapine has been the mainstay of ARV prophylaxis in most countries. But maternal, what they call highly active antiretroviral therapy, also known as HAART, has since been shown to reduce postnatal transmission 4-fold. So later guidelines have recommended shifting away from the single dose drugs towards more effective longer term regimens. Now, there have been a couple of different approaches, either treating the mother or the baby, and it's been found that maternal HAART used earlier in pregnancy has led to greater efficacy. And the higher the viral load at enrollment and the shorter the duration of HAART, the more the risk of infection. So the mainstay now in developed countries is extended maternal or infant prophylaxis. No, sorry, that's developed countries. And continue breastfeeding up to 12 months. Now, this, I think, are the most exciting findings that we have had to date. We've had studies now which show what happens when exclusive breastfeeding and antiretroviral regimens are used together. You can see that there are no less than 9 of these published studies now, and they show that transmission through breastfeeding can be reduced to 1% or less. Some of them show no transmission at all. These studies are the hope for our future, and I've given you the references so that you can look them all up if you want. So a consensus outcome has emerged as a way of measuring the effectiveness of various interventions, which researchers call HIV-free survival. And that means the combined absence of an outcome of either HIV infection via breastfeeding or death before HIV infection as a result of formula feeding. And I've done a little chart here to show what the survival rates. The babies with the white nappies, these ones here, or diapers as you call them, are those who don't become infected with HIV even when they're exposed to the virus. The ones with the little blue pants are those infected during pregnancy and birth if there are no interventions. The ones with the red are infected through breastfeeding, and the ones in the black are the ones who would die from diseases other than HIV against which breastfeeding is protective. So you can see that breastfeeding with no interventions at all causes the highest mortality. No ART and exclusive breastfeeding reduces the number of babies infected through breastfeeding, but doesn't help the number who are infected in utero and during delivery. ART and no breastfeeding saves babies who would have been infected during pregnancy and delivery and through breastfeeding, but there's increased mortality from other causes. But ART and breastfeeding together seems to be the way forward. And actually these numbers are a little exaggerated, one of each. When women receive a long enough course of ART, then the numbers of babies infected during birth and during exclusive breastfeeding is less than 1% each. So ultimately the realization of the importance of HIV-free survival rather than merely HIV prevention is what led to this aha moment in attitude towards breastfeeding in the context of HIV in developing countries. So finally the research had showed conclusively that maternal antiretroviral regimens during pregnancy and breastfeeding greatly reduce transmission, and exclusive and continued breastfeeding significantly improves overall HIV-free survival. So in 2008, we had a review of the evidence. In 2009, we had more guidelines, and we had fresh advice. WHO issued 2 rapid advice documents. The first was on the use of antiretroviral therapy for the treatment of pregnant women and prevention of mother-to-child transmission. And it stated for the first time there's enough evidence for WHO to recommend ARVs while breastfeeding. So the recommendation was either lifelong ARV treatment for sicker women or short-term prophylactic antiretrovirals for women with higher CD4 counts, which would be withdrawn at the end of breastfeeding. The second rapid advice concerned infant feeding, and it said that national authorities are encouraged to identify the most appropriate infant feeding practice for their communities, either breastfeeding and ARVs or infant formula. And importantly, mothers are no longer encouraged to choose their own infant feeding method, but to receive recommendations from their healthcare providers. And this was a big help to all of us with breastfeeding. In July 2010, WHO released formal guidelines, and these are the current documents. The change in policy differs from the current policy differs in 2 major respects. Firstly, there is a reality of a double standard in recommendations necessary for industrialized and less sophisticated areas, and there is a paradigm shift in the way that human rights are to be interpreted, away from the previous emphasis on individual human rights, in other words, individual infant feeding choice, towards national recommendations, and this is consistent with public health. The antiretroviral recommendations were also more specific. Now this looks quite complicated, and I probably won't go through this with you now because you can look at it yourself if you want to later. Suffice to say that many developing countries still use these protocols, and the important thing is that in 2012 there was a programmatic update in the use of antiretrovirals to suggest that instead of either or protocols for mothers who were sicker or mothers who were less sick, now it was that all pregnant mothers should receive antiretroviral therapy from the time of HIV diagnosis and continued for life. And this made everything much simpler. It was safer for mothers, their survival could be maximized, and there were all sorts of benefits. Now, this has meant quite a lot to us in the first world, and it has been very profound in the UK. In 2009 there was a consultation started in view of the good outcomes with ART and exclusive breastfeeding, and most women in UK who were HIV positive were actually born in sub-Saharan Africa. So the British HIV Association issued a revised position on HIV and infant feeding, and it continues to recommend formula, but if you read on in the document, it confirms support if the mother chooses to breastfeed, and it suspends the risk of the baby being removed for the mother. So this is an important first world first, and it means that in effect mothers who want to breastfeed can. We had a further important development at the beginning of this year. The American Academy of Pediatrics issued new guidelines which in many ways reflect the British guidelines, and I have included the link to this in your handout so that you can read it for yourself. It's quite important to note that it recommends that HIV-infected mothers should not breastfeed their infants. But if you go on reading, it says that an HIV-infected woman, in the unlikely circumstances that she would want to breastfeed, she can. She shouldn't be referred to Child Protective Services, and she should receive support, including help to exclusively breastfeed. So that's where IBCLCs would come in. It's very, very important that a mother considering breastfeeding should have as low a viral load as possible. And it's been found that the duration of antenatal antiretroviral therapy should be for at least between 11 and 16.5 weeks. And less ARVs will lead to a situation where the mother still has virus in her blood and would make breastfeeding very unsafe. So ideally she should have it for at least 13 weeks prior to delivery, and that would make it safer for her. It's very important that she has a sufficient duration of antenatal ART and meticulous adherence. And the reason is that there have been 2 studies showing that what happens when mothers don't adhere to their drugs, and these seem to be the ones that cause the most risk of transmission. The first one is the Shapiro study from Botswana, and in this one only 2 women out of 709 transmitted HIV through breastfeeding, and it was found that both the women who transmitted had not been adherent to their medications. Likewise, this Silverman study, for the first 6 months there'd been nil transmission. In the second 6 months, 3 mothers out of about 186 had transmitted the virus, and once again all of them had stopped taking their medications for one reason or another. I'm getting ahead of myself. So that's what had happened to these women. One had had a religious experience of a cure, and she had stopped taking her medications. One had claimed good adherence to her medications, but she still had a viral load, high viral load. So the preconditions posing the least risk of HIV to the baby are that the mother has been treated with full heart for at least 16 weeks, probably to be safe 13 to 16 weeks. The mother has an undetectable viral load. She remains absolutely adherent to her antiretrovirals throughout breastfeeding, and the baby should receive prophylactic ARVs for the first 4 to 6 weeks. In UK, they seem to give them for 4 weeks. In the US, they seem to give them for 6 weeks. Now, lactation management, the mother should exclusively breastfeed for the first 6 months of life. It's very important. She should receive prompt preventive and therapeutic treatment for breast fullness and potential mastitis. If she does have to mixed feed, then she could use heat-treated, flash pasteurized express breast milk, which would be fairly safe because the virus is inactivated. So for those of us who might be assisting first world HIV positive mothers who want to breastfeed, what do we need to do? We need to share all the research and share the national policy. We need to talk about the risks and benefits of various feeding methods, and especially the importance of antiretroviral therapy, duration of treatment, whether the mother has an undetectable viral load, and it's very, very important that we should not guarantee safety. The mother is the one, of course, that has to make the decision, and she's the one that has the responsibility for making that decision. The lactation consultant is to support her choice and to assist with lactation management. That would be to exclusively breastfeed or to suppress lactation if she chooses not to breastfeed in the end. We could offer references for the journal articles for discussion with her doctor, and it would be a good idea to report to the doctor and to liaise, at least to offer to do so. Now, for countries that absolutely do not permit breastfeeding, it would be important to explore whether the mother needs legal representation to prevent coercion. And I have found myself phoning around for attorneys and lawyers who will take on these kind of cases, and you'll find that they're very good. One of them even offered to go to the hospital to visit one of the mothers I was working with. So in the US and the UK, this would be unlikely to be necessary, but if you're in other countries, it probably would. And of course, you should document everything with extreme care. But it can be very rewarding working with these very special mothers. So the goal is a happy, healthy mother and a happy, healthy baby. And I'd like to acknowledge that the mothers that I've worked with who've shared their stories, hopes and dreams with me, the very valuable colleagues and friends I have all over the world who share their journal articles and their experiences and their expertise, all my friends at WABA and friends of WABA who provide me with opportunities to disseminate up-to-date information. And lastly, I'd like to thank the GOLD team for allowing me to speak on this very controversial topic. So over to you, Fiona. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pamela, for such a wonderful, detailed presentation, such a necessary conversation to keep up to date, to know how to advise. It's complicated. There's no clear answers yet, but it certainly seems like we're getting there. Your latest, evidence reports are just wonderful. I'm amazed and so pleased to see such great results from the latest studies. So that's very exciting news for mothers everywhere. Thank you so much for your presentation. We hoped you enjoyed this valuable presentation, and I invite you to join us at our next annual Gold Online Conference. To learn more, please visit us at www.goldlactation.com and be sure to sign up for our newsletter to stay in touch. From all of us at the Gold Learning family, have a wonderful day.